Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, the director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I want to welcome all of you to our first faculty research colloquium for the fall semester. I want to thank Dominique Francesca, who's the business manager of the Center for Humanities, for her work in organizing this colloquium, and also for Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, for also helping to organize this event. And today we're very excited to have with us Sarah Ovink and Aqua Gerlin Morell. Sarah Ovink is an associate professor of sociology at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses primarily on inequalities in higher education pathways by race and ethnicity, gender, and income. And she uses mixed methods of inquiry in her research. Her publications have appeared in a variety of journals, including Gender and Society, Social Currents, and Research in Higher Education. Professor Ovink is also a co-editor of a recent volume entitled Intersectionality and Higher Education, Identity and Inequality on College Campuses, that was published by Rutgers University Press. And she's the author of Race, Class, and Choice and Latina Higher Education, Pathways in the College for All era, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Professor Ovink is also the recipient of 2015 NSF Career Award investigating intersectional inequalities in STEM and non-STEM undergraduate pathways. We also have with us Aqua Gerlin Morell, who is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology. She has worked with Dr. Ovink in various capacities for 2 years and on this particular paper as well. And so we're excited to have both of you with us today. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a very kind introduction. And I'm really, really pleased to be here along with Aqua and to present our work together. So I'm going to start off with a few slides to give an overview of our work as well as present some of our respondents' voices in responding to the research questions that we were seeking to examine. So let's see. Okay, so should be sharing screens now. Our project, as you probably saw from the title card, is entitled University Diversity Projects and the Inclusivity Challenge. And here's what we were seeking to find. So Aqua, I'm going to turn it over to you to describe our research questions.
Okay. Did you want to do the overview first or just?
Oh, let's just do, yeah, let's just go with the research questions. That'll provide enough of an overview, I think. Oh dear. Is it just me or is Aqua frozen?
It looks like she might be frozen, so we can.
Okay. Well,
we can give it a
hopefully she'll.
second. You might
Hopefully she'll come back. I will go ahead and give a brief overview, and then if she doesn't come back, then I'll keep it going. Okay. So in this project, this is a portion of the work that I've been doing for my 2015 NSF career grant that Dr. Johnson mentioned at the beginning. So this overall project is interested in discovering intersectional differences in students' pathways to and through higher education, with a particular focus on STEM pathways. So by intersectional differences, what we're primarily looking at is differences by gender that occur simultaneously by race, ethnicity, and also potentially by family income. So we know, for example, there's a lot of research to show that women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, as we refer to it throughout the presentation, are not having the same equitable outcomes in persisting in and receiving STEM degrees as traditionally overrepresented students in this topic, which is white men and white women. So we see that a lot of these gaps have been closed by white women, and that men have more equitable pathways, but we're still seeing lingering discrepancies The proportion of BIPOC women, for example, who express a desire to obtain a STEM degree is not proportionate with the percent that actually do obtain those STEM degrees. So the overall project is interested in looking at all the ways in which students might be stymied in their progress, aside from, let's say a change in heart or a desire to pursue a different sort of major. All right, so it looks like Aqua is back. So we are ready for the research questions. Go for it.
Yes, my apologies. Campus Wi-Fi.
It happens.
So our analysis identified 3 concepts that previous literature has not fully accounted for. And these were engagement with educational programming and organizations, particularly those aimed at diversity, equity, and inclusion, perceptions of institutional inclusion and outreach efforts, and complex experiences of intersectional identities and interlocking oppressions. We sought to answer 4 research questions. The first was, what factors influence belonging at MSU, which is Meadow State University? How does belonging vary by race, ethnicity, and gender? Third, how do university inclusion efforts affect belongingness from undergraduates' perspectives? And lastly, how do students make sense of contested claims about belonging, its importance, and its remedies?
Great, thank you. So the way we sought to pursue these questions in this particular project, and by the way, Meadow State University is a pseudonym. All the names that you will see in these slides are pseudonyms to protect respondents' privacy. The way we sought to answer these questions in this project was by having undergraduates convene focus groups with fellow undergraduates. And these focus groups were organized primarily along race, ethnicity, and gender lines. So for example, students convened focus groups with Black women, Black men, Latinx men and women, white men and women, and Asian men and women who attended Meadow State University. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of our findings as a result of these 45 focus groups that students convened over a 4-year period between 2015 to 2019. We found that students perceive that the university, MSU, wants to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion results, but that their efforts fall short because the students perceived that the university's efforts were not authentic and that the efforts seldom included student input. We found that BIPOC students might feel satisfied with their academics, and yet they report carrying a heavier mental and emotional load as they pursued classes at MSU. They might feel like they have to compromise their identity needs in order to achieve an elite degree and career success via pursuing that at MSU. We also found overall, though, that intersectional differences are important and they structure how students develop or not a sense of belonging at MSU. Furthermore, Black students in particular suggested that they were accepting a bargain in attending MSU, which is defined as a predominantly white institution and a historically white institution. They accepted the product, the elite education, knowing the conditions. So Black students were not coming into this university naive about the makeup of the student body or the kind of experiences that they anticipated. However, some of these Black students reported in their focus groups that as their experience proceeded, they started to wonder whether they had made a bad bargain or possibly wish that they had prioritized different needs. Black students also in particular in this study reported that they did not come to MSU for its diversity. So this is a university that has made a lot of strides or attempted to make a lot of strides in recent years at improving its diversity, equity, and inclusion profile. But Black students reported that the reasons that they came did not align with MSU's interpretation of themselves as a diverse space. So Black students, in a sense, reported sacrificing and compromising in order to get the prestigious degree that they wanted to get from MSU. Finally, we found that stereotypes are alive and well and that they structure how students behave in academic and social spaces. Race, gender identities offer various affordances, so positives, but also some constraints, some negatives for students on a continuum. That is, this is not static. It's not to say that every day it's great to be a white man or every day it's an awful experience to be a Black woman. These were nuanced experiences that varied from day to day. And yet the BIPOC students that participated in focus groups more often reported hearing negative stereotypical comments directed at them. And the white men in the focus groups, and many of them freely admitted that they had the most affordances in this context. They had the most positive outcomes and the most positive experiences in this context. And that in turn, Black women reported sensing the most constraints. Now we're going to move on to some quotes. I've told you a lot of stuff about our study, and Aqua told you what we were looking to find. And so I feel like it's important to get respondents' voices into the mix. So Aqua's going to read a few samples of student responses in their focus groups so you can get a flavor of the evidence that we're pulling from in making these statements.
So the first quote describing the participant's sense of belonging when it comes to race and ethnicity, gender, and academic major. There were similar sentiments shared among and between the Asian women and Latinx women, specifically regarding gender and then race, ethnicity with Asian, Latinx, and Black groups. And this quote is from a Latinx woman. "I honestly feel discouraged, especially with my major, with art. You make a lot of stuff related to your culture, and it's kind of hard when you're the only person, not just with Latinas. Like, I can count the number of minorities there are in the class on my hand. There's kind of a solidarity in that, and it's kind of hard getting reception from like white people because you feel like there's a boundary. You kind of know that you're different." And next set of quotes, a sense of belonging, and this sense is coming from a place of fear. So a major event that made them feel excluded was the university appearing to support white supremacy by refusing to fire a TA without outright saying they support it. They have a fear, the participants have a fear on campus because of the idea that something bad can happen to them because it has happened to someone in their racial group in the past. And this is a quote from an Asian woman: "Nothing has happened yet." And the second quote is from a Black man: "There's no faith in the institution for most of us. Like, even if something happened to us, it's just going to get swept under the rug. Or they're like, oh, well, that was just a one-time thing. So it's like, even if something happens to you, there's really no point of reporting it or anything because ain't shit gonna change." These are sentiments that the white groups did not share. Interestingly, white men groups expressed greater understanding of why organizations for minority groups existed. However, two groups made up of white women expressed that DEI student organizations separated minorities from the rest of the population in a way they, the white women, reacted negatively to. White students didn't feel a need to seek organizations addressing their identity because they already are made to feel like they fit in and belong at MSU. And then good old diversity at MSU. This quote is from a Black man: "Everyone knows about the whole marketing of the diversity and inclusion. You turn on or log onto an MSU website and there's a Black kid, and 95% of the time we know. And it's great to market us, but it seems like the way that it's done is as a token to try to say like, hey, we're this diverse school, we're inclusive, go look at our website. Oh, they are diverse. I see a picture of this Black kid on their website. Sometimes it feels like we're just here to be seen, like a false presence almost, false appearance. What MSU wishes that they could accomplish, they're trying to make it look as if they've already gotten through." And then these are some quotes specifically in response to how they feel about diversity initiatives at MSU. And this first quote is from a Latinx woman: "Maybe that's how it has to be until we get to the point where we are actually diverse." And the next one is also from a Latinx woman: "How is it diverse when I'm the only person like me in my class?" The next one is from a white man: "Fake it till you make it." And the first quote, "Maybe that's how it has to be until we get to the point where we are actually diverse." That is what the participant was talking about, that maybe if they just fake it, we'll eventually get to where we need to be. And then the next quote is also from a white man: "MSU is really behind with the world." And then the next quote is from a white woman, and that's supposed to say while. While diversity marketing, I don't think the white is supposed to be in there, so we're just going to ignore that. So the quote is supposed to say, diversity marketing materials do not depict reality on campus. And this is a sentiment from this white participant that is shared with the BIPOC groups. And then our last quote is from a Black woman. They always say, they as in the institution, they always say that they are making plans, but the plans are not executed properly. And overall, all participants agree that the diversity and inclusion efforts at MSU are severely lacking. White group participants were the only participants who stated that they believe the university has done a good job with diversity and inclusion initiatives, and some participants even stated that the university has done all that they can do. However, some white group participants did acknowledge downfalls of the university over-exaggerating diversity of student population in advertising when it is not the reality when walking on campus, as well as in the ratio or student diversity regarding race. Black, Latinx, and Asian students state that photos of minorities are overused on university websites and pamphlets. Diversity is misrepresented. Participants state that the university states that they are doing all of these changes and have done X, Y, and Z, but the students do not notice any changes. Black and Latinx participants stated that maybe if the university keeps faking it, that they may actually reach significant levels of diversity and inclusion. Participants agreed that the university needs to do more to recruit more diverse students and to provide the resources to retain them once they are here.
All right, so that is all of our slides. I'm going to stop the share and we can talk about things.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It's a really important topic and one that is certainly at the front of a lot of conversations happening across our institutions. I'm wondering if you both can explain some of the background for the current diversity, equity, inclusion work, often referred to by that shorthand of DEI, that's occurring on U.S. colleges and university campuses. After all, this diversity, equity, inclusion work has become a familiar term as DEI that was not in use in the 1980s or 1990s. And I'm wondering if you could paint a picture for us of some of the more recent contextual factors that could help us understand some of the recent changes and the ongoing challenge.
Sure. I'll start us off, how about? And then Aqua, you can add some more contemporary context. So for the historical context, in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of universities began ceding to student demands, student protest and student demands from groups that we would call historically marginalized on campus: Black, Latinx, Asian groups, Native American groups, that were demanding to be paid attention to, really, and to have their concerns and needs met on campus. So we see in the 60s and 70s the establishment of ethnic studies departments at many universities. We see the establishment of centers, such as Black student unions, that are created as a space for organizing, as a space for camaraderie. And increasingly, people see them as a safe space, a place to get away from the overwhelming whiteness, let's say, that remains at a lot of our flagship universities across the United States. And then through the 80s and 90s, we saw the creation of pan-ethnic or pan-racial organizations, multi-ethnic centers. Virginia Tech used it when I arrived in 2011, still had a multicultural center and an Office of Multicultural Engagement, I think it was called. It's hard to keep track of all the acronyms and titles and things over time. And then again, in recent years, we've seen that those multicultural offices are once again kind of breaking apart and acknowledging that different groups have different needs. And again, some of this is as a result of student protest, that the needs of Latinx students in today's universities are not necessarily the same as the needs of Black students, immigrant students, first generation students. We see a broadening of the scope of what we consider to be groups that fall under that umbrella of needing better inclusivity in the university environment. So at this point, we definitely see a lot of disagreement, I mean, a lot of agreement on the part of universities and administrations that equity is an important goal and one that universities can contribute to. But we still see a lot of disagreement about what the right efforts are for how to achieve those goals. So Aqua, do you want to add some more contemporary context to that?
Sure. In relating back to what you said about students' needs being different, there's also different political climates and different beliefs that are off campus and is brought onto campus with students as well as like faculty. And so with that, there are people that the political climate has been, I guess, hot, for the lack of a better word, for lack of a better
challenging
term.
Yes.
Yes, it has been challenging. And so the needs change as the political climate changes. And then also with students' needs, there is now an understanding that it takes more than just going to class and getting good grades, making sure you're turning your papers in on time and not procrastinating in order to be successful at any university. And so the students are trying to find ways to different avenues to find different support so that they can be successful in obtaining their degree.
Well, this is such an important area of work, and I'm wondering if you could tell us how this became part of your research focus. What led you to examine some of these issues of diversity and inclusion in higher education?
Thanks for the question. This is part of an overall project that I always wanted to pursue from the time that I was a graduate student. So when I was trying to narrow down a dissertation topic, my grand goal was to investigate intersectional differences in students' pathways to higher education. As I describe myself now, my dissertation advisor very wisely told me, well, you can't do everything. You are one person. And you can't collect enough data on all of these different groups and do it in the way that you would like, using both qualitative and quantitative methods. So for my dissertation, I focused on a narrower scope. But in proposing an NSF career project, it was an opportunity for me to think bigger and also to put together a research team, including students like Aqua and like many of my other former students who have graduated, to help pursue this research. Because I do feel like, there are a lot of studies out there that examine one group or another. There are a lot of comparative studies that compare the experiences of one group versus, let's say the dominant or quote unquote ideal student on a given campus, which historically has been white men. Those were the only people that were allowed to pursue higher education at the beginnings of this country. And that has only expanded, and sometimes slowly and sometimes after protest over time. So I wanted to have if I was going to examine inclusivity and really pair those concepts, diversity and inclusivity, because to be fair, universities have done a lot to make their spaces more diverse than they used to be. But diversity does not mean, if we have diversity, that's people in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean that those people feel included and that they feel that they can bring their whole selves into that room. And furthermore, whether or not they have a voice at tables where decisions are made, which brings in the concept of equity. Do people have an equitable voice in decision making? Anyway, so I wanted to, if I was going to study inclusivity, I wanted to envision a project that was also inclusive, that wasn't limiting to any one group. Other aspects of our project have investigated, for example, the experiences of students with disabilities on campus, and focus groups have been convened with those students as well. They're not in our presentation today, but we are pursuing multiple lines. We look at students with first generation versus students who are not the first in their families to attend college. We look at family income status. So for me, my personal background, being the first in my family to obtain a PhD, but definitely not the first in my family to pursue higher education, was that I saw and could see the ways that my personal pathways were smoothed over by my parents, by my income background, by the scholarships and low-cost loans that I was able to obtain back when I was pursuing higher education. And so for me personally, this sort of project is about creating the kind of university environment that I thought as a naive freshman was already happening, and came to realize as I pursued a sociology degree and then as I pursued a sociology PhD, was, as I read more and learned more about the world and moved beyond my small social circles, realized that that was not actually the world that the world I thought I was living in was not the same for everybody. But I'll turn it over to Aqua to tell us a little bit about this question as well.
I thought that was great, but I think when you first asked me to join, if it was something that I wanted to continue with, because originally I was your research assistant through my assistantship here in the Department of
you were assigned
Sociology.
to me. Let's say that.
Yes, I was assigned. But then I continued to work with Dr. Ovink during the summer. And then you asked me to be on the paper with you. And I was like, yay, sure. And it's also really interesting seeing the whole process of it as well. And then also analyzing what undergraduates have to say. And I was also an undergraduate at one point, and I was just like, oh, I can see this, I can see that. So yeah, that is why I'm here. I didn't have to be here. This isn't part of my assistantship, but I was asked and I chose to stay.
Yeah. Oh, I guess.
Great.
Yeah. Sorry, one more thing that I wanted to point out, and I forgot to when I was showing the slides, is that we are presenting student perspectives. And so sometimes we get a question about this research. Well, what is the university side of the story? Isn't the university really doing more than what the students perceive? And it may be, but what I find really interesting and endlessly fascinating about this line of work is that students' perceptions are really often what is driving their sense of belonging. So whether or not a university is doing XYZ, as Aqua presented during the slides, what matters for students' experiences is what they perceive. And so if they don't see or perceive the things happening that they would like to see, then it alters and influences their experience nevertheless. And that's something that I do find endlessly fascinating about doing this kind of work.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point to make. And it points to some of the intricacies of this subject of research as you really get into it. I want to take a second to remind our audience that we will have, in about 2 minutes, we'll invite some questions from you. You can use that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window if you want to put some questions on the queue, and in about 2 minutes, we'll start taking those if you wish. But we also want to hear a bit more about some of this project. And one of the things that really strikes me with the type of research that you're doing is it would be very easy to aim to capture the sentiments of these students and end up not doing so because of maybe the questionnaire is not really well designed, or you're thinking one thing when you ask a question and people hear something else when they try to answer it. So that's actually a big methodological issue that one has to attend to when conducting this kind of research. So could you both talk to us about that element of research design and how you have sought to make sure that what you're trying to capture is actually effectively rendered in whatever instrumentation that you're using? And in this mode, I think you refer to the focus group as being a particularly effective vehicle.
Yeah, that's a great
But
question.
how did you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was a big challenge with this project in particular, because the goal was to have peers interviewing peers. It's a peer-to-peer focus group format. So I did not collect any of these interviews. Aqua did not collect any of these interviews. And Aqua joined me because one semester she TA'd for a class in which this happened. We trained undergraduates to conduct interviews. However, you're leaving a lot up to 18 to 22-year-olds mostly to interpret and to take in the training. So I had a list of questions, 4 or 5 questions that students were required to ask every time. But then, because this was part of students' projects for their class, they also had the opportunity to design their own questions. And this was a process between instructors and TAs and students. They would propose questions. We would have them revise their questions, sometimes multiple times, until they were asking a good question, or at least a question that wasn't a leading question. So, for example, students would often come up with questions like, don't you find that sororities are exclusive? That leads a respondent to answer, well, yes. The natural impulse is that people want to agree with interviewers and they want to please interviewers, even if it's a peer. So we would work with them to make their questions open-ended. Tell us about your experience with sororities would be a better question, for example. So this led to a lot of challenges in analyzing these data, because we had some questions that didn't vary from focus group to focus group that we can analyze in a fairly standard way. And then we had other questions that were, some of which were extremely interesting, but that vary a lot or maybe appear in just one focus group and not the others. So here we really do focus on, these are students' perceptions of their experiences in a university. We have to really carefully frame what we can say about the data, given the data that we have. And that is a methodological problem that anyone might face, right? There's always questions that we would love to answer that we just don't have the data to answer. And so this caused Aqua and myself, in some cases, to kind of retrofit our research questions. At one point, maybe Aqua can remind me, I was asking a question that Aqua was like, you can't answer that question.
I don't remember, I don't have the notebook with me where I had that in, but we had like 4, but I think the first question was split into 2. And I was like, after analyzing this, we didn't answer this. So that had to change. But in general, with qualitative methods and like semi-structured interviews, there are going to be topics that come up from the participants that may or may not come up with the other focus groups. But one of the good things about focus groups is that when someone talks and then other people are in agreement, they're like, yeah, you can hear that in the transcriptions. And then also someone just like, well, going off of this person, I agree with X, Y, and Z, and then they'll add to it. So yeah, and everyone's experiences are different. And then we find the similarities in that. But just because one group, something may have came up in one group, doesn't necessarily mean that other students may not have felt that way, but it just wasn't captured because the conversation within the focus group didn't go in that direction.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, but it is very instructive to hear about the kind of thoughtfulness that has to go into the design. Sometimes, as you point to, the iteration of the method as you get so far in, so that you're not asking leading questions, you're really optimizing people's ability to just share what they perceive to be this experience. And with that, then I'm wondering whether, based on and understanding the caveat you just pointed out, that you're not interviewing administrators at universities, you're talking to students about what they're experiencing. But I'm wondering, based on that, if you have found that there seem to be 1 or 2 strategies for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion work that seems to be more effective than others, based upon what students are experiencing on these campuses.
Yeah, that is a tough question to answer. I have spent, years on this type of research. And whenever I run into anyone at a workshop, or I'm, constantly asking folks for recommendations of what to read, I often ask if anyone has come across a model university that they would really point to and say, this university right here is doing an excellent job with DEI. I have yet to find that perfect model. Not even near perfect, not even like, oh yeah, definitely we can point to this university or that university, they're doing so great. We do have some ideas of the kinds of engagement that students respond well to and the kinds of things that students are asking for. So I'll talk a little bit broadly about the kinds of engagement that we see as effective. And then I'll turn it over to Aqua to talk about what students were asking for, because she's closer to those recommendations than I am. So a lot of folks point out that colleges and universities that have a history of, it's their reason for being to provide a tailored experience for students. So the classic example of this is liberal arts colleges, but more pointed examples might be women's colleges and universities, and historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. These are not institutions that are perfect, but these are institutions that have usually as part of their stated mission, everywhere on their websites, everywhere in their pamphlets, that they exist for the benefit of the groups that they are seeking to serve, and that have a smaller, more tailored environment for student success. Now, again, these are not perfect institutions either, but where we could find some inspiration, even in a large university or a large historically white university, would be bringing diversity and inclusion into the disciplines and into every aspect of what professors, instructors, and students are engaging with. So we've seen some movement toward this at our own institution at VT, for example. Dr. Sand started as president, I think just 1 year after I arrived here, in 2012, 2013, something like that. And his goal, we could obviously argue about whether this is successful at VT, but the goal was to diffuse the responsibility for diversity and inclusion into the disciplines, rather than having a single centralized office where then everybody at the university says, oh, that office has DEI under control, that office is taking care of it. So having it instead as a philosophy that everybody, myself, every professor, every instructor is responsible for inclusion in their classroom, inclusion in the ways that they talk with students, et cetera. So again, it's difficult to say like what model exactly is going to be a recipe for success, but these are some ideas that I think the best research right now is pointing toward: tailoring programs, making sure that everyone is responsible for learning about and trying to provide diversity, equity, inclusion. So Aqua, do you want to talk a little bit about what some of our respondents had to say, what they would like to see?
Sure. One of the first things that comes to mind is funding, and they would like to see equal funding spread between the organizations addressing identity. So the different groups that are for Asian students, Black students, Latinx and Hispanic students. And then there are some initiatives that they have seen at MSU, and one would be food, particularly with Asian food and trying to make it more traditional. And the students have said that the food is not good and it's not traditional. And then similarly with trying to be inclusive with the halal food, but then also cooking the same meat where you cook pork, which is considered unclean. And it's kind of like they're missing the mark. And then there is also students wanting the university to be proactive instead of reactive when it comes to political climate again, and making sure that they are making statements before something happens on campus. And then they have to put out a statement that says we stand with our students or whatever, when that should have been done before that. And then also making a statement that any type of hatred will not be tolerated. They want to see that. And then they also want to be heard. That's probably the main thing. I don't know. So the students didn't say anything specifically about which avenue, but we kind of already know that students don't really respond to email surveys. So maybe trying to find a better way that's maybe fun to try and get students engaged and share their what they want to see as far as like changes. And then they also recommended that the hiring practices change as well, and not just having someone for diversity purposes in the room if that person does not know what their community needs. So just putting someone Black, a Black woman on a program leading it just because she's Black and she's a woman, and they may not even know what the needs are for the Black community. And then another one was having representation for the counseling centers, as far as having multiple counselors, not just one or two, who come from various backgrounds, and that students would feel better coming to instead of just having to choose from white counselors. And off the top of my head, because I saw something in the chat as far as like questions from the audience, but off the top of my head, those are things that students would like to see.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful to hear how they're reflecting on their experiences and what they perceive to be some useful strategies. And I'm wondering, when you said there hadn't been a model university, when you ask people, that doesn't seem so shocking, but there probably are maybe some model strategies that maybe some things might work more than others. But I'm wondering also if you have seen important blunders from the perspective of students, or there are things that have happened where students say, well, this is one thing that we've experienced at this institution that was clearly the wrong thing to do, or that was just highly ineffective, or that produced perhaps the opposite of what was intended. Have you come across anything like that?
Yes. So one, and this was in multiple groups. So there was a requirement for all incoming students, whether they're transfer students, freshmen, first year graduate students coming in to MSU. It was a like diversity module thing that they had to do. And they were just like, it's a joke. They would hear other students talking about like, well, yeah, I just sat there and did it, blah, 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 blah. So they're reading these, they're listening and reading the modules, but you can't click until the person finishes talking. And so they're not really engaged with the material. And then it's one thing to participate virtually in this. And then there's another thing to actually take what you've learned and what has been said and apply it to your life, as far as the interactions that you have with people. And it's mandatory. And so everyone has to do it, but it doesn't mean that, like, how is the university grading or assessing, measuring how effective that mandatory diversity training module thing is. And I think, except for the Latinx men, the Asian, Black, white, and then the Latinx women groups all stated similar sentiments that this is an initiative that is not working, because what does it mean? This is mandatory, we did it, now what? No one's applying it. The people who should be applying it aren't applying it, which would be the majority, the white groups.
And I would say it's a very difficult problem, because if you don't make your DEI instruction mandatory, then you miss a lot of people, right? If you make it optional, then you miss a lot of people. But if you make it mandatory and there is no option to apply or to really put students in a situation where they have to confront possibly internalized biases or subconscious prejudice, things that they are stereotypes that they hold that they might not even consciously know about, if they don't have an opportunity to confront and practice in a mandatory training, then it might not be very meaningful. They might sit there and, click through and they're thinking in their head, blah, 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 or they're listening to music in the background. So it's kind of like, it's hard to know what to suggest.
Virtual may not be the
right,
best.
maybe not virtual.
Like some type of hybrid in person, have different speakers, but it's just you're passively participating. You're just clicking, like you just said.
Yeah. And there are some universities that have moved to, and this is difficult in pandemic times, but there are some universities that have had more success piloting in-person kind of intensive 1 or 2 day events that are more akin to diversity training that we adults might go through, where you're going to multiple sessions, you're hearing from different speakers, like Aqua just mentioned. Of course, that's time consuming, it's time intensive, it's expensive, but it might be worth considering for universities that can put together the funds and who want to see more dramatic change in their student bodies.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to make. The mode of delivery can make a big difference. And well, this is a team-based project, as you pointed to. So, Sarah, at the beginning of our discussion, you talked about the scale of things and how that shifted from your doctoral research to the research that you did after your PhD was finished. And Aqua, you've been part of this team collecting the data, interpreting. There are lots of pieces involved with this. And so I'm wondering if the two of you can also share with us your experience of doing team-based research. What would you identify as some of the more important elements of team-based research to ensure its success? And what would you find to be some of the more challenging pieces of it? And what's most rewarding?
That's a good question too. So I'll start off, and then maybe you could tell us, Aqua, about what's rewarding and what's not.
Okay.
Well, so part of the reason that I love working with teams is obviously I am just one person. And as may or may not be obvious from those watching the video feed, I am white, I'm a woman. That is my perspective. I also have, I can go into more particularities of my positionality. I am a white upper income woman who comes from a middle class background, et cetera, et cetera. So just bringing my own perspective, as educated as I've tried to make myself, is limited. And so if I bring in a team approach, then I always learn things from the others that I work with, whether they're colleagues, whether they're students, whether they're undergrads. I've worked with dozens of undergrads over the course of this project, including those who were directly collecting the focus group interviews for us. So I always learn a lot when I work with other people. Of course, it's possibly more efficient to work alone because you have only yourself to please. But when you work with a group, you are able to see more than when you work alone. The challenges for this project are students keep graduating. I keep telling them, like, don't you want to stay and be a PhD student forever and keep working on this project? That's not to say I can't work with them after they leave. And in fact, some of the alumni, so to speak, of this project include Maggie Nanny, who's now a research analyst at Eastern Carolina University, and they remain an author on some of our papers that are in progress. Jess Hurling, who's a current PhD student, but who's off the project currently because she had to go collect data for her own dissertation. So students leave, and that can be challenging, trying to keep a team together long enough to produce a paper. So, bringing on new students is a training challenge sometimes. Like, we have a lot of data. After all of these years of collecting it, not just the focus group. So we have individual interviews with 113 respondents that we followed over 5 years. So that's more than, with some attrition, that's still more than 400 individual interviews over 6 waves, because we did an additional pandemic wave. We were done, and then a pandemic happened, and we thought, well, we better find out how this affected people's trajectories. So anyway, managing a large amount of data is really only possible with a large team. I could not have amassed all of these data. I could not have possibly begun to analyze all of these data by myself. Aqua, what do you think?
Your sense? Yeah. What would you
I
say
will start
about
off with what has been the most.
contribution?
I will start off with what has been the most rewarding, which has been, as a grad student, being a part of and also watching the process of this research. Because once I graduate, I'm like, I'm having ideas of what I want to do, and I'm like, this is my baby. And then how am I going to be able to like have other people work with me? And I'm like, oh, so another thing that is rewarding, well, so it was also challenging as far as like analyzing all of the data. And I'm like, oh, this is a lot. And so I didn't know how much time it was actually going to take me. But I wasn't pleasantly surprised, but I was surprised. And I think I had a little bit of anxiety because this is Dr. Ovink's work. And I'm learning a lot, and I'm like, okay, I am in charge of this, this, and this. I don't want to let her down. So it was a little bit anxiety inducing for me, but also rewarding, because now in my classes, with talking about like my dissertation and everything and writing peer reviewed articles, I'm like, this has been very helpful. And I think back to the different parts of the process with this paper. We are not done, but the processes up until now has helped significantly. And I don't think there's really been any other challenges except like time, because I think we had to keep pushing the date as far as when we wanted a draft done. And that happened.
We're always so
more.
optimistic. So optimistic.
Yeah. So I will just say time as far as like with working with someone, because we both have lives outside of the academy. And so it's like, okay, this is what we're going to do.
The pandemic happened, and it's still happening.
Exactly. But we're getting it done. So the only other challenge I would add is just time. And then the last thing, as far as like rewarding, is having conversations about the findings, and then also learning about new perspectives, like, oh, I found this, and oh, this is interesting. Okay, read this article. So yeah, learning a lot.
Well, this has been really enlightening to hear about the work that you're doing, and particularly on such an important and timely topic of university diversity projects and this inclusivity challenge. Sarah Ovink and Aqua Trilin Morel, thank you so much for taking time to share with us this important research that you're doing. I'm going to thank those of you who've joined us, Center for Humanities, and please be on the lookout on our listserv and in our announcements for the upcoming colloquia we have and for this fall and also for next spring. So please look out for those announcements. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.